it's a positive film. It has heroes and villains, and that it essentially is a fun movie to watch. It's been a long time since people have been able to go to the movies and see a sort of straightforward, wholesome, fun adventure.
Well, it's a fantasy. It's not science fiction so much as it is space fantasy. And it's about people. It's finally about people and not finally about science.
The story, when you actually put it into words, is only so much nonsense to hang a great visual experience onto. It's the stuff that fairy tales are made of.
Sort of boiling down religion into a very basic concept. The fact that there is some deity or some power or some force that sort of controls our destiny works for good and also works for evil.
Marvelous, healthy innocence. Great pace, wonderful to look at, full of guts, nothing unpleasant. I mean, people go bang bang and people fall over and are dead, but, no horrors. A sort of wonderful freshness about it, kind of like a wonderful fresh air.
It's got whatever you want it to be. It's pure entertainment. It's like a roller coaster ride, and it can be interpreted as long as you enjoy it, which is the intention.
Hello, welcome back to Generation Skywalker, and more importantly, welcome back to our continuation of our book month. Now, joining me, as always, I've got Craig Spivey with me. Good evening, Craig.
Good evening.
And we are delighted to welcome two guests, both fan for trackers, I believe. Mark Newbold. Good evening, Mark.
Hello, how are you?
I'm all good, my friend, all good. Fan for tracks busy?
Always busy, but there's always news. And even when there's not news, we just make it up so there's something to do. So, yes, we're always busy. It's good.
The best way. And Mark Mulcaster is with you as well. Good evening, Mark.
Hello there. How are you doing?
It's lovely to chat to you, Mark.
Yeah,
this is going to be difficult, isn't it? Because if I give one of you two a question, you're both going to answer.
Just refer to us by our surnames. That's normally what we do. So, because even me and Mark get confused. And there's only two of us recording, it's like, which Mark's talking? I don't know.
I open my mouth and another voice comes out. It happens a lot.
That's because you're a Disney puppet.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's a mouse pulling your strings. You're like a little ventriloquist dummy. Yeah.
Now, we're recording a book month. We've got a few interviews with people, doing a couple of round tables and stuff. Now, you both on Fan for Tracks Radio, you both do a show called Cannon Fodder. Perhaps Mr. Mulcaster can tell us about that, because that is based around the literature, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so Cannon Fodder is co-hosted by Brian Cameron, Matt Booker, myself, and other Mark Newbold, and it is literally everything, basically literally based in Star Wars. So it's a books, it's a comics. We would discuss audio books, but the content from a kind of like a reader's perspective, but also from like a kind of like a consumer perspective. So we delve quite a lot into like schedules and delays, which of course has been quite a lot at the moment. And we basically just have a natter and just talk Star Wars for an hour, which is, I think, one of the best things you can do these days.
Indeed, especially during these times. I hope you've both been keeping well, actually, during lockdown and everything that's been going on. But do you find that when you're doing a show like that, you're pressurised to keep on top of everything? Do you literally consume every bit of literature that comes out?
There's so much stuff, though, isn't there? It's tough to do that.
Yeah, it's tough, but also that is kind of a good thing about having four people on the pod, is that actually there's always at least one or two people who've kind of caught up with stuff. Brian's really good. He kind of writes really exhausted show notes, and sometimes it might even be like, have we seen the latest Star Wars book club kind of YouTube video? And sometimes we can get like a 10-minute kind of conversation discussion out of it, or other times it's just kind of like a quick kind of like, oh, this was cool, and move on. So, but there's always lots to talk about when you cover everything, the comics, the magazines, because of course, like we've got to plug Mark's journalistic endeavors for Star Wars Insider, as well as the actual kind of novels and stuff. So there's always plenty to talk about.
Matt Booker must be sorted for the comics because he's sitting in a comic shop all day. I'd expect him to be bang on top of that. Yeah.
Yeah, he's on top. In fact, he's great because he's always kind of like giving us kind of a heads up of what's coming out, and especially variants and like second and third printings and stuff like that.
Nice. Well, we've asked you on for this show. We're going to do a little round table to celebrate, which is often considered probably the best trilogy of books we've seen in the whole of the Star Wars canon and legend. You might debate that, but they've always been highly sought after, and that is the original Thrawn Trilogy, the Heir to the Empire, and the other two that followed that. Now, first of all, have either of you read the new Thrawn books?
I'm currently listening to the audiobook of
Chaos Rising, which I'm very much enjoying, and I've nearly finished it. So that'll get finished this week. But I didn't read the previous three. I never got round to reading the previous three. I don't know if you did, Mark.
Yeah. So I'm pretty good because I tend to make a point of doing a lot of the audiobooks just because, like a lot of people these days, I still have kind of big, long commutes of like an hour, maybe 2 hours plus sometimes. So you can get through a 15-hour plus audiobook in a week, which is great. So I've started Chaos Rising. I think I'm only about 3 chapters into it, so it hasn't really kind of gotten too kind of like meaty yet. But I did finish the previous Thrawn trilogy, which I was kind of a little bit hot and cold on it, to be honest. And the problem is, and this is something that I was kind of considering on the way back tonight, was just thinking about this podcast, is actually how much the effect that the performance by the audio narrator actually has on how you like the book or not.
Yeah.
Because obviously the pacing and the characterizations make it difficult to then take a step away sometimes and kind of pick up the book and then try and read it in your own voice. And obviously, especially now that Mark Thompson is basically the king of audiobooks for Star Wars. I mean, I can't read a Star Wars novel normally without actually sometimes hearing it in his voice, which is sometimes fun, but also can be a little bit annoying at times as well.
So I was going to ask you that. I said, in comparison, so obviously the original 3 back in the 90s are now legend, and these are obviously in the new canon line. Has Thrawn's character changed too much? Has too much been altered, their timelines?
The thing is, and actually, just to plug the show again, I think we've talked about this on both Making Tracks and on Cannon Fodder, is actually, there is a risk with Thrawn, especially now, that he can sometimes be a little bit too clever for his own good. And I mean, I think they kind of ported the character pretty well over from EU into Star Wars Rebels and then into the canon books. But yeah, it's and the previous like Thrawn trilogy is interesting because he's kind of he's a protagonist, whereas obviously in the Empire trilogy back in 92, 93, he was the antagonist, so he was the bad guy. But kind of in that the new Thrawn trilogy, he's kind of like he's serving the Empire, but it's it's kind of like all the cards are stacked against him because obviously he's an alien, he's come from like this unknown region and stuff like that, and he propels himself through the ranks really quickly, much to the kind of like chagrin of Eli Banter, who's kind of like his aide, who's basically with him for the whole journey pretty much. It's an interesting take, and also I think over the years Timothy Zahn has moved away from almost like a classic Star Wars kind of vibe to the books being a little bit more kind of like considered and more like a thriller, so the actual kind of it's a whole thing of like it's set in the Star Wars universe, but sometimes it doesn't necessarily feel like Star Wars. It's kind of like almost a different genre, completely.
But so this book came out, was it 91 or 92 first of all?
91, I think this was, wasn't it? Yeah.
91. Where was Star Wars at in 1991? What was the landscape like going into these books?
It was a darn sight quieter than it is now, that's for sure. I suppose you'd consider, a lot of people have said it, some people have denied it, but I think it's pretty irrefutable that when Heir to the Empire hit #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list, and they did kind of put it out almost as an experiment, it really was a statement of, well, okay, Star Wars has been pretty quiet since you'd say 86, 87, end of Ewoks and Droids. The Ewok movies have come out. West End have just released the role-play game in 87, and then there's not an awful lot apart from, I think, the 3D comics. I think there was pretty much nothing released apart from West End stuff all through that time period. Now, if you're a gamer, which I was, I consider what people call the dark times to be amongst the busiest periods of my fandom, because I was role-playing 3 nights a week. So it was Star Wars, the most immersive Star Wars we'd ever had since we were running around in the playground pretending to be, Han, Luke and Chewie and stuff. But you get to 91, Heir to the Empire comes out. They're almost testing the water. I've seen things where Lucasfilm sort of said, kind of testing the water to see if the interest is still there. And obviously it was. So when Heir to the Empire comes back and goes in at number 1, and it was very much pitched as being the sequel to Return of the Jedi, that's kind of lost in the static these days, when Air Now and all the other books and comics of that time are now legends, like you said a moment ago. When that came out, there was no doubt this was the sequel to Return of the Jedi. We weren't getting films, but we were getting books. So everybody who wanted to know what happened next, it was this, and very soon after Dark Empire, it was those 2 books and comics that started to fill the gap. And blimey, talk about unplugging the dam. It really went crazy after this. But yeah, when this comes in, other than occasional video re-releases, and obviously the fandom was still there, it's kind of just at the cusp of the internet really starting to become a thing for the general public, sort of 91, 92. When was the World Wide Web? It was around about that time, wasn't it? So, it was the right time for Star Wars to get really early in on that train. But yeah, it was a wet Wednesday in Grimsby for Star Wars. Sort of time this came out, it was pretty quiet.
Yeah, I remember it very well. I remember it coming out, and I wasn't a big gamer like you, but I was still a fan. And to see this arrive with that official disclaimer on the back saying, this is sanctioned, this is legit. Yeah. I couldn't get enough of it, and I think it's very telling that the medium that they chose was an adult novel. It was aimed at us. It wasn't a game. It wasn't more toys. It was an adult novel. It was a continuation of the story for those people who had experienced it in the theatres. Yeah,
that's a good point, really, because I think there's a tendency now in 2020 now, although I think we're going to forget this year in its entirety as soon as we possibly can. But, if you look at stuff now, for example, the High Republic publishing program that's coming out, they're not just releasing a book, and they're not just releasing a comic. They're releasing an IDW comic aimed for kids and a Marvel comic. They're releasing an adult novel and a young reader's novel. They're sort of pitching it at all the different levels of Star Wars readership, which to me seems strange, considering all the stories are part of the whole now. And, when the Star Wars novel came out, yes, they did a young reader's edition, which I think I read once. When I was 7, I was reading that Star Wars novel from front to back and starting again and reading it again, because a different time, wasn't it? You couldn't go. I can watch Star Wars on my phone now. Back then there wasn't nobody. I don't think we had a video player. You know what I mean? There was no opportunity to watch it unless your mate had got a Super 8 player and he could watch like 8 minutes with no sound in black and white on a shonky video sort of player. But so Star Wars was pitched to everyone. And so it brought kids up. I think Star Wars, to a degree, brought kids up. It advanced their reading level. Whereas now, publishers tend to pitch down towards kids and they don't challenge them anymore. So I think it's weird that they do that in a way. I get it's a marketing opportunity. I get why they do it. I'm not, there's obviously a plan and a logic behind it, and I do get that. But your point is very astute and correct, is that, yeah, they threw it out they weren't pitching at teenagers anymore. They weren't trying to grab a new market. The old inverted commas, the old Star Wars fans, in 91, I was 20. So, I'd been through the Star Wars, that first generation Star Wars, as you say, of kids that watched it, played with it, got into it and did everything else. And now here's a novel that's going to tell me what happened next, because when Jedi finished in 83, we really did think that was it. There was all these, I think Starlog were talking about the prequel trilogy. Pretty much as Jedi came out, they were saying, well, the next one's going to be about a young Obi-Wan and a young Anakin. So we knew they were coming at some point. Took its time, but we knew it was coming. But really, 7, 8, and 9, until the Disney sale, was just pie in the sky. So you're not going to see that. It's not happening. this was 7, 8, and 9. Heir to the Empire at the time was episodes 7, 8, and 9. People kind of forget that.
Yeah, and I think also actually there's still a large selection of people who probably wish this was 7, 8, and 9. If we're being honest. I mean, because actually I was slightly at the different end of the spectrum. I was just, I think, year 8, so I was kind of like about 12, and just happened by chance to be forced to go into the local library and pick a book to, no pun, and so that that's how I because I was kind of like gobsmacked at the time. I was like, oh, there's more Star Wars, and they actually had Heir to the Empire and they had Splinters of Mind's Eye on the shelf, but Empire kind of grabbed my attention, and that was it for the next God knows like how many weeks and stuff. I was sitting in classrooms reading Star Wars books instead of going out and playing football with the lads. So
it made you a man. It made you a man.
Yeah, it put hairs on my chest, but I promptly shaved off.
Craig was only saying to me earlier that the books did read like a movie, didn't they? They were fast paced. What do you think contributed? What aspects do you think made those books be received like they were?
So one of the things that I vividly remember and really fondly remember, and I suppose you'd say prepping for this podcast, I went back and I re-listened to the original abridged audiobooks of this trilogy, which was read by Dennis Lawson and then Dark Force Rising and Last Command by Anthony Daniels, which in themselves is really cool to actually have Star Wars actors of that era narrate Star Wars, which is great. But there's just something about the pacing, and I think the one thing that Zahn does really well is that in a slightly semi-convenient way, everybody's kind of split up like they are in Star Wars, but they're always brought back together, and he kind of layers the seeds of like everybody's going to get back together. You know where the end point's going to be. I think it was just a fact also that we're in kind of like uncharted waters as well. We're at like 5 years after Return of the Jedi. Seemingly this government's been set up, but there's still kind of fringe elements of the Empire floating around. And then you've got this, this mastermind who just kind of comes in and just kind of catches everybody off guard. And I think that is kind of, unfortunately, the first kind of big bad is probably one of the most kind of like memorable. So therefore, later novels, it's really hard to live up to Thrawn, because actually when they start to kind of like do other Imperial kind of officers and stuff, you always comparing them to Thrawn. So like Dala and stuff, like people like that. If it was just like a vibe, I mean, I know sometimes you can kind of criticize it a little bit, but there's kind of beats where it's kind of like almost kind of referencing back to the original trilogy, which you can completely understand why they did that, given the reason why they released a book in the first place. But I think it helps tie everything together a little bit. I mean, I know possibly now we would say it's a bit fan servicey, but I think back then it was quite nicely done. Just a couple of exchanges between like Han and Leia and stuff like that, where I think he says, "Oh, I don't want to discuss it with a committee," and all that kind of stuff. That kind of banter that we saw on screen is now in printed word in a new story.
No, that's a really good point. I remember when I used to run a site called Lightsaber back in the day, and we did some book reviews, and John Hicks, I did a lot of, the guy that did all the role play games mastering for me. He's been our role play editor for years. He still is on Fantha Tracks. John wrote the review for this, and he made that exact point. He said, if me and him have been mates since 1984. We've been like mates for like 36 years, and we had a lot of conversations over those 36 years, and we probably couldn't remember many of them outside of the role play games, when there's little things that happen that you remember, in the game. But in real life, you have a conversation and it's generally forgotten. And Heir to the Empire did kind of come back to referring to stuff that it's almost like the characters had read the novel of Empire Strikes Back and were sort of riffing on it. But Mark makes a great point in that the last Star Wars novel to come out before Heir to the Empire was the last of the Lando Calrissian trilogy. So we hadn't had a Star Wars book for 8 years. So, so we were starved for Star Wars. We'd had nothing on screen since, like I say, I'm pretty sure it was the end of Ewoks, which really was pitched at kids. So I think you could forgive them the self-indulgence of sort of referring back to memorable moments, because they were at this point trying to reignite that spark and make sure the fandom was still there to justify pushing on with not only sequels to this book, but then, other books, Truce of Bakura and all the stuff that came after that. And then all the licensing stuff that started up again, all the Applause stuff, all the Galoob stuff, all the things that, probably all got bought up by Hasbro that they own all of it now. That made sense at the time. And fan service is a funny word. I mean, it's used in the most negative terms all the time. I don't think fan service is necessarily a bad thing, because if you're not servicing the fans, who the hell are you making this stuff for? So you can be too on the nose. Of course, you can be too on the nose and roll your eyebrows roll your eyes rather at stuff like that. But certain times it's just subtle enough that you go, yeah, nice. And I think this book's got quite a few bits of that in it. And you ask whether or not, what was it about it that made it work so well as a trilogy? Mark said earlier about kind of wish this was the 7, 8, and 9 instead of the 7, 8, and 9 that we got. I like the 7, 8, and 9 that we got, but I wish it had been better thought out. This feels like it. This feels to me like Thrawn. I'm doing the same as you, Mark. That Zahn had sat down with the team at Del Rey and said, right, this is my plan for the trilogy. This is the book 1, and this is book 2, and this is book 3, and this is the starting point, and this is where you leave them, and you can run off the back of that. And you know what I mean? He kind of gave them a full SP. I don't know if that's the truth. That's how it feels to me. It just feels like this was planned. Every episode finishes on a cliffhanger. There's a battle. There's development of characters, new characters. I mean, I went through some notes for this as well, and just reading through different names that came back. I haven't read this book for 30 years. I'm near enough 30 years. And it was just so cool looking back and seeing all these names and places. And it's like, I'm seriously thinking of giving this another read. It's been a long time, but yeah, it's a substantial trilogy. It really is.
I think something else they got right was the balance of new characters to the old characters they were keeping in play. Yeah. So just right, just enough for you to keep track of, what was suddenly quite an expanded cast of characters. And also they were all very well drawn, and they weren't black and white. There were shades of grey there. It was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I've always really liked Talon Card as a character. I've always found him really quite fun, because again, it is I'm guessing Zahn sat down either with the licensing guys or just sat down, watched Return of the Jedi, and went, right, okay, what are going to be the big questions that need answering? And it's like, who fills Jabba the Hutt's girthly kind of like space that he's vacated? So yeah. But I mean, it's funny because actually, especially when you listen to the abridged audiobooks, because they're only about 2.5 hours long, because they fit onto like 2 audio cassettes. You suddenly realise that, especially by the time Last Command, he's packed in a lot of like smuggler characters, like to fill out that whole fringe area that actually, with the exception of Lando and with the exception of like Han, we don't really know many characters from that kind of like that background. So that was really fun. And of course, then we've got like Mara Jade. So, who again is one of those characters that I think had a lot of potential, and possibly still could do, depending on if like Lucasfilm had kind of like the guts to kind of put her into canon, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good point. This reminds me of certain albums that come out, I was thinking The Darkness. I love The Darkness, and their first album came out, and it plays like a greatest hits album. But it's just their first album. Like Appetite for Destruction, it's like, that's like a greatest hits album, but it's just the first album. And this, as a book, or as a trilogy, really, it's kind of the same, because, like you say, Mara Jade was voted the most, Insider did it way in the 90s, the most popular character, Star Wars character, was Mara Jade, above the film characters and everybody else. And Thrawn, always up there in like the most devious villain inverted commas, because Mark made a great point earlier about how he started off as an antagonist and then becomes a protagonist in the more recent books, and that's certainly the case in Chaos Rising. Like I say, I'm about 2/3 through it, and it's completely from his point of view yet, and you are sympathetic and almost rooting for him, because he's got a destiny, where he's got to go, and you kind of want to see how he gets there. And the scenario and the background that he comes from, he can be nothing but the protagonist and the guy that you're sort of rooting for and such. But this, like I say, Talon Card and Mara Jade and Admiral Thrawn and Captain Pelion, and there's Jorah Sabaoth, and just all these things throughout this book. There's so much. It's really quite something else. I hope it's one of those things they do go back and sort of mine for future ideas, because there's a lot in this. There really is a lot in this.
Really set the bar, didn't it?
Oh, massively, yeah,
really. Massively.
Following on from this trilogy, basically, it opened the floodgates, didn't it, for Star Wars books? Would that still be the same if this had flopped?
No.
Yeah.
I think at this point of time, Lucas had, he wound it down with Star Wars. I mean, I used to get Bantha tracks back in the day, and I think the last 2 issues were like a year apart, and it was quite obvious even then, as a sort of mid-teenager, that it was winding down, and that ILM were off doing Back to the Future and Indiana Jones and all the other Star Trek more than Star Wars at that point. They were off doing other stuff, and John Williams was doing other stuff, and Lucas was focusing on the company. So you'd read more about THX and ILM and the graphics group, which became Pixar, and Sprocket Systems, which became Skywalker Sound, and all the things that he was doing at the time, Edit Droid, and and suddenly the Insider wasn't just about Star Wars anymore. The Insider, Bantha Tracks wasn't just about Star Wars. It was about Lucasfilm as a company. And occasionally you'd get, there's a new Ewok movie coming out. Great, Never got it on television. We had to find it on video, or it came out at the cinema, if you were fortunate enough to find it. But the point being is that Lucas was putting his attentions elsewhere from Star Wars. So when this came out, whilst it was definitely Lucasfilm, the creative side of Lucasfilm saying, well, let's give it a punt. Let's see if it sticks. And it did massively. I think I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure all 3 went to #1 in the New York Times bestsellers list.
Yeah.
If they hadn't sold stupid numbers, which they did, you've got to wonder whether or not Lucasfilm would have thought, well, we're doing great with all this other stuff. We've diversified as a company, and Star Wars is always going to be dear to us, and maybe we'll come back to it in the future, but we're not going to put a lot of effort into it now. That wasn't the case, clearly. Like you say, this comes out, the first book comes out, what business people, money people are like. They thought, right, Tim, write the next 2, and then let's get Kathy Tyers to write Truce of Bakura. Let's get Dave Wolverton to write Courtship of Princess Leia, and just set them up. Kevin J. Anderson to write the Jedi Academy trilogy, and just get them all up and running. And they probably had that plotted out in one of those legendary Lucasfilm sort of Skywalker Ranch meetings that they had, like 3-day summits. They probably planned out 5 years worth of books, and just worked it from there. So I think if it hadn't have hit, maybe it wouldn't. I'm pretty confident it wouldn't have took off the way it did. But because these were such massive hits, it was a good gamble. Definitely a good gamble.
No doubt you would have interviewed Timothy Zahn over the years and had contact with him. When it comes to writing something like this, after a few years of nothing, how much of a blank canvas does he have? How much say is Lucas saying this, this, and this?
From my understanding, he was tasked with writing the book. I think he had a fairly broad scope of what he wanted to do. I think they kind of knew when they wanted to set it and give it enough distance from Jedi. Because don't forget, Marvel had gone beyond Jedi as well with the comics. And at this point of time, as much as, and I know canon's a dirty word, and it's a ever evolving thing, and they really should call it continuity, not canon, because everything with Star Wars on it is canon, because it's Star Wars. It's, you know what I mean? It's all canon. What people really mean is the chronology of it, the continuity of it, and where it fits. That's what matters, and that's what should be thought of or thought through more deeply. Zahn was basically, I think he was in contact with Bill Slavicsek, who was the guy that was really behind the West End Games Star Wars roleplay stuff, and that all of Slavicsek's notes and basically all the Galaxy guides, source books, and everything was just dumped on Zahn's desk, and they said work as much of this in as he can. So that was a big part of his sort of bread and butter towards pulling it together and sort of building a new galaxy almost, because now I'm very much into the maps. I love the galaxy map. I'm really into that sort of cartography side of it. Not that I'm any kind of expert on maps, but just the galaxy, the geography of the galaxy has always interested me. There really wasn't much of a geography of the galaxy then. Point being, you look back to the original Star Wars, they leave Tatooine, they go into the hold of the Millennium Falcon. Luke's waving his lightsaber about getting shot by the training droid. There's the little spit between Han and Kenobi, and then bleep bleep, we're coming up on Alderaan. But if you look at the map, Tatooine is bottom right right on the edge of the outer rim.
in the Arcanis sector, and Alderaan is pretty much right at the top of the map. So so they're literally the opposite end of the galaxy. Quite clearly, they don't travel the entire galaxy in one conversation. There's things that happen. You could argue that there's breaks in the timing of it all. Point being is that George never sat there with the galaxy map and worked out where everything was. So as time goes on, these things get filled out, and Heir to the Empire was really the start of this sort of second wave of Star Wars continuity where all these things get filled out. And I think Zahn had a lot of latitude to fill in these gaps, like Mark just said, the Smugglers Alliance, and start to fill out the underworld in that post Jabba the Hutt era, because he was the kingpin of the galaxy. And of course, 5 years later, Shadow of the Empire comes out, and you find out that Shizor's probably even on an even higher level than Jabba. Jabba has to sort of answer to him with the whole Black Sun thing, and now we move forward another 20 years, and you've got Crimson Dawn introduced in Solo. So they keep layering it up, which is really interesting, and that all kind of fits. But I think he had a lot of scope, and thank goodness he did, because clearly, what a fertile imagination to it would have been easy to write another Han Solo book. I mean, I love the original Han Solo trilogy. They're probably my favourite Star Wars books. Star's End, Revenge, and Lost Legacy. I love them, but they're very much like, you're reading. They're a bit like reading the current Thrawn book. Actually, the only character from the current Thrawn book so far really is Thrawn. It's in places you don't really know that well, with characters you've never met. And the original Han Solo trilogy was Han, Chewie, the Falcon. That's it. I mean, they set it the corporate sector. There's no other characters that you know. That was the proviso for that trilogy. But they're brilliant books because it fills out the character of Han Solo so well. And this trilogy is kind of the same in that you've got people that it's a great mix of Han, Luke, Leia, Chewie, R2, 3PO, Lando, Mon Mothma, all those characters, and then bringing in all this new cast of characters that very quickly became increasingly important because all you'd got was the books. It's another 30 years ago. It's an era where all we got was these books. So that's a really long answer to a very short question, but I think he did a great job of filling it out.
Do you think Timothy Zahn's kind of been he is now just Thrawn? Does he? I don't know too much about Timothy Zahn outside of the Thrawn books. Does he write other books? Because it seems to me that he's just he's been quite in depth with Thrawn for quite a long time.
Yeah, I mean,
he was a big name, wasn't he, when he came in?
Yeah. I mean, he was a big name, and he does do other books. I mean, I can't say I've ever read any, but that's only because there's just too many Star Wars books to read. So, but the thing is there are times where you do wonder, barring the blue skin and the lack of hair, where Thrawn starts and Timothy Zahn ends, and so on and so forth. I mean, he's got the character down pat, and this was one thing that we did discuss actually the other day, and I actually said it would be nice to maybe say, okay, Timothy, thank you for doing all this work with Thrawn. Now let's do something completely different with you. Let's take you. Why don't you do a book based in the sequel era, for instance?
Yeah.
So because that's it. I mean, he knows a character so well. I mean, obviously he did like Choices of One, which was kind of Mara Jade centric. Again, it's his own character, and then like Allegiance, which is quite a cool book. But even with a Hand of Thrawn duology, even though Thrawn's dead, it's all about Thrawn really. And actually, again, kind of coming back to that whole thing where he's kind of like transitioning Thrawn from being a bad guy to a good guy. It's kind of like hinted at, or fairly overtly explained that Thrawn was aware of Yu Zhong Vong before they invaded the galaxy, so he was trying to help get the Empire kind of ready for when that invasion actually came, which is really cool. But I think that was just based on the fact that they wanted another Thrawn book before for the prequels came out and before the New Jedi Order books came out. So. But I don't know if have any of you guys read anything else by Timothy Zahn?
I haven't.
No, me neither.
No, I know he did a lot of stuff. He'd won the Hugo, I think, and he'd won big awards. But no, I hadn't. I've only ever read his Star Wars stuff.
And like you just said, Mark, you were saying you struggle to see where Timothy Zahn ends and Thrawn begins. And you can see that both of you struggle with that because you've both called him Timothy Thrawn tonight. So,
Yeah.
Awesome. Good. That's gonna be our ghost author name. When me and Mark write a Star Wars like fanfic, we're going to be called Timothy Thrawn.
Timothy Thrawn, I like that.
Yeah. Right, I'm going to get you three, okay, because you're more invested in these books than probably I have been. So for listeners who perhaps have not read this trilogy, I'm going to ask each one of you to do one book at a time, to kind of like give the book a kind of synopsis and to also explain where our heroes are from the original trilogy at that point in time for each book, okay? No pressure. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Newbold, with Heir to the Empire.
Oh, blimey! How do you concisely put that together? Well, obviously, it's 5 years after Endor. The New Republic's pretty much got a handle on the galaxy as much as they think they can. In that they're a new government, post Empire, the galaxy did kind of fall apart a little bit, but they're pretty much holding it together. There's a new threat. Let's say that there's a new threat appears. And that's sort of where Thrawn comes in, this Chiss commander that's risen up the ranks of the Empire. I'm going to mention the character that I thought was really interesting. That was somebody that people really sort of dug at the time, and kind of gets lost in the static a little bit now. Jorah Sabaoth. Jorah Sabaoth comes into it. He's kind of a little bit out there. He's sort of like an unhinged sort of Saruman character living on a mountaintop. Was it Mount Tantis? I think it was Mount Tantis.
Yeah, Mount Tantis on Wayland. Yeah,
that's it, Wayland. That's right. And they're looking for the Emperor's hidden weapon stash. They think there's like a weapon stash that they can use because they obviously want to, throw unrest into the New Republic and they want to bring it down because they're the Empire. I can't remember. Were they called the Imperial Remnant at this time, or did that come later? I think that came later, didn't it?
That's later. Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, you're bringing you other characters in. Oh, yeah. He finds out that Leia is pregnant, if I remember rightly, with the Jedi twins. And he's decided he's going to train the Jedi twins in the way of the Force. So he's basically trying to sort of inveigle his way into that because they'll see that as like new heirs to the Empire. There you go. Yeah, it's the book that really introduces all the characters into the storyline. Leia's been hunted down by the Nogri. Correct me if I'm wrong. Rook, the character that ultimately kills Thrawn, he was voiced by Warwick Davis in Rebels, wasn't he?
Correct.
Thought it was the same character. So so Thrawn basically builds this fleet, and there's a whole attack. There's a big battle at the end of the first book, and Lando and Han, as I remember, I think Rogue Squadron are involved, managed to sort of stave them off to the shipyards at Sluisvan. And Thrawn, having been built up and sort of getting his sort of pieces in place, doesn't have the big victory that you would expect him to have at the end of the first book. He actually gets defeated, which I always thought was a cool twist because, like Mark says, all the way through for the intervening or following years, he's that chess master that's not 3 moves ahead, he's 5 moves ahead. And it was kind of interesting to see him get outwitted at the first big battle. But obviously, Mara Jade's introduced. She's got a grudge against Luke because obviously he killed the Emperor, as they thought. Of course, she hadn't seen Rise of Skywalker at that time. So she's got a grudge because she was the Emperor's hand. So there's a whole sort of enmity between her and Luke, which obviously ultimately gets resolved. But it was a great way to introduce it. It certainly set up all the cards for the that wasn't a pun. That's card with a CARDS, not a KARRDS. It sets it all up for the following 2 books. But yes, blimey, I've never had to summarise a book like that before. That's hard work. Good luck to whoever's doing the next one.
Caught you on the hop, didn't it, Mark?
I like it. You had to drag that one out, yeah.
I thought you did a good job. Who just said they'd like to do the next one?
I'll do Dark Force Rising.
Go on then, Mark.
Go on.
Gives you a bit of time to study there, Craig.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so 5 years after the events of Return of the Jedi, the fragile republic that was born with the defeat of Darth Vader and the Emperor, and the now infamous second Death Star, stands threatened from within and without. Can you tell I'm reading this from the dust jacket of the first edition? So basically, Dark Force Rising basically picks up, I think, fairly quickly after the events of Heir to the Empire, and the middle chapter in this trilogy has a lot more kind of political intrigue. This is there's a plot between one of the councillors, Bosk Failure, to kind of supplant Admiral Akbar by kind of saying he's incompetent and actually he's in league with the Empire because suddenly out of nowhere a load of kind of Imperial credits have been transferred into one of Akbar's accounts. What happens is also that Princess Leia is continued to be threatened by the Nogri in Heir to the Empire, but she captures one of the Nogri when she's on Kashyyyk, and she arranges to, along with Chewbacca, to go to their homeworld of Onaga to basically kind of like see if she can help them out because apparently the planet's kind of been poisoned by a massive starship battle that happened, to her knowledge, during the Civil War. And so she goes there and has kind of like some time to spend with Kabarik's clan, and kind of discovers through that actually it wasn't the Galactic Civil War that this space battle had kind of like poisoned the planet, but it was the Clone Wars. And what had happened is that Darth Vader had seen the abilities of a Nogri and took advantage of the fact that they weren't very technological and kind of had droids planted on the planet to kind of try and clean up the poison and the chemical waste. But actually what they were doing was they were kind of keeping it in a kind of like a eternal kind of like sort of balance where basically the planet wasn't actually getting any healthier. So therefore the Nogri were reliant on the Empire for aid. And therefore Vader and the Emperor had the ability to use a Nogri as assassins. So at the same time, Han and Lando meet ex-Senator Garn Bel Iblis, who basically was thought to be dead, but has basically been kind of fighting his own war against the Empire out in the outer reaches. They discover that there was this fleet in the Clone Wars era called the Katana Fleet, which was about 200 odd dreadnoughts, which all slaved together so that if they could minimize the number of crew that they needed. Because of a hive virus, the crew went mad and basically jumped the whole fleet into, oblivion as far as they were concerned. At the same time, Talon Card is working at the other end of this, and he came across this Katana fleet and figured out what it was when he was like a crewman or something on another smuggling ship. And his plan was to basically sell the ships or offer the ships to the New Republic before the Empire learn of them and then take them. What ends up happening is the captain of that starship gets taken by the Empire, and the information of location of where the Katana fleet is extracted from the captain, and he tells them the location. So then when Han and Leia and Luke finally get their kind of strike force ready to go and find the Katana, they realize that actually there's only about 15 or 16 dreadnoughts left because the Empire had come in already and already moved a load of the ships away. Whilst they're on the ships, they get boarded by stormtroopers, and it's during this time that actually Luke and Han discover that actually the stormtroopers are in fact clones. That's kind of where the cliffhanger is left. So the end of Dark Force Rising is kind of like the Republic's lost because the Empire on Grand Admiral Thrawn's got one up on them. They don't have his fleet, and now they're facing potentially another Clone Wars, which kind of leads into The Last Command.
I'll tell you something, that was in depth. I don't think I need to read that one. You nailed that one.
Better than mine.
I think Mark's you just said you'd recently listened to them, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, I did listen to him, I think, like last week. But I mean, I lend you my audio cassettes and my old Sony Walkman so you can listen to them. Yeah, because to be honest, actually, those as much as I hated listening to the abridged versions back in the day because they were abridged and cut down, but if you wanted to get through like the old EU really quickly, those are abridged novels which end up being mainly read by Anthony Heald are really good because they're really short, so you can get through a load of novels and get kind of like the overall gist of stuff in a couple of hours. Anyhow, let's move on to Last Command.
So Craig, Last Command.
You really don't want me to spoil these books for the listeners, do you, Stuart?
Don't read the last page. Okay?
Spoiler alert.
There's a bit of scrapping. There's a clone made out of Luke's hand. There's some babies born. And then Thrawn gets furloughed back to the Outer Rim on 80% pay.
Perfect.
Yeah, But if there's an elevator pitch, if ever heard it. I mean, literally, the elevator went up to the first floor and that was it. But hey.
My research didn't get as far as the last one. I got halfway through the second one.
But no, it's interesting. You pick up on a good point there, Craig, because actually, the whole kind of crux of the final book is, it's a clone being created from Luke's hand from Bespin with his lightsaber, which is kind of like
to use, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Luke or something like that, which is really hard. Yeah, it's really hard for to kind of distinguish when you listen to the audiobooks. At least when Anthony Daniels read it. I think Mark Thompson puts a little bit more emphasis on the extra U, but yeah, I mean that is quite a clever way of Mara fulfilling the Emperor's last command to her, so it's a way of Mara kind of fulfilling her wish and striking down a Luke Skywalker, and basically being able to kind of move on kind of with her life and stuff. But it's interesting because even in the bridge novels you kind of get a hint that there's a bit of sexual tension going on there between Luke and Mara, which is kind of across the whole EU is on again, off again. She has this weird kind of thing with Lando for a bit as well, and it gets a bit odd. But yeah, I thought the Luke and the Mara dynamic was really clever.
It was a good twist having to fulfill the Emperor's last command, like you say, to kill Luke. That was a really cool twist.
You don't need to listen to number 1 and 2 or read them, but the third one you do.
Left a bit of intrigue in there.
The cover art on these 3 books, the initial cover art by Tom Jung, is quite exceptional, isn't it? I mean, they've re-released these with reprints, but they've never recaptured the artwork initially. What do you boys think of the covers? Because they are smashing. I love Dark Force Rising, the initial one.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that is one thing that defines not only this trilogy but the a lot of expanded universe books is the artwork. You've got the Drew Struzan artwork for Darksaber and Children of the Jedi and stuff. But yeah, these original, first 3 by Tom Jung are really good. And I think the difference is, they put our big 3 characters front and center, and Thrawn's kind of less important, at least in the Dark Force Rising one. I've just got the book in my hand. That's the reason why I can remember it so well. It just kind of it feels right in some respects, and they do look a little bit older. Actually, you can see Leia looks a little bit older than what she did in Jedi and stuff. But it says it. It's got the Falcon. You've got Luke with a lightsaber. You've got Admiral Thrawn and TIE fighters and Star Wars and Gold Leaf. So hell, that's fair to jump off the bookshelves, isn't it?
Yeah, it's funny you say about Drew Struzan. I mean, Tom Jung did these 3. I don't know if I think he'd done some posters in the past for Star Wars. I don't know if he did anything after, but Struzan did Truce of Pakura straight after this, and then, like you say, Courtship and onwards. And most of obviously wasn't that long after this, maybe 3 years after this, when did Tom Jung do the Jedi Academy covers? I could be wrong. I might have done them as well, but certainly Struzan did. The greatest movie poster artist of all is Drew Struzan. You could confidently argue, and he was doing. He did the the Glover Vader, Mission to Mount Yoda, and all those the kids book
those
covers.
Classics.
Absolute classics, stone cold classics. He did he did a whole bunch of Star Wars novel cover, Crystal Star, like I said, Darksaber, Children of the Jedi, a whole load of them, right up until I think just before, right up until New Jedi Order, basically. But yeah, these 3, the original 3 covers. I like the new ones, don't get me wrong, and like you say, they've just been re-released here in the UK a couple of weeks ago, I think, in that horrible new size format that we have. I think is it the B size now? I hate it. They're halfway between a trade and a novel, and they just look horrible on the shelves. But there you go. It's the artwork that I think the American Del Rey reprints had about 3 years ago. Lovely artwork, but these feel like, especially in the time they came out in, like you say, 91, 92, 93, it was like having movie poster covers on the front of your books. So yeah, they were very cool.
I think where the book set the standard for writing, the covers probably set the standard for the rest of the covers. For the rest of the expanded universe, no matter what role Han Solo had in any novel. He was on the cover waving a blaster around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why wouldn't you want to get Harrison Ford in there, though? You know, it's part of it. You can use his likeness, get him in there.
I was having a look actually. If you were a book completist, now these have had a lot of different covers, haven't they? Across many lands. I've just got some on my screen now. Have you seen the Czech Republic 1993 release of this cover?
I think I've got the Hungarian version.
So the Czech, I'm just going to put in the side chat here.
Is that the cartoony one?
Oh, blimey. That looks like it's come straight from an episode of Droids.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
But that, in fairness, that, and I apologise in advance to the artist, but if you look at the original version of Heir to the Empire, the US and the hardcover version, it's basically that, but this version just looks like it's been drawn by a 12-year-old. I mean,
it's Chewbacca that's making me laugh.
Yeah, he kind of looks like a Fraggle.
Yeah. Just,
Can we now bring in our guest, the Hungarian artist who did the covers too?
Yeah, I'm just browsing them. Some of them are fantastic. It's completely
I mean,
nuts.
they did that lovely silver cover, didn't they? When it was the 20th anniversary, they did that beautiful
25th,
silver cover.
Well, listeners, you'll have to go and check out the enhanced version if you want to see what we're talking about. That's nothing like doing that, but yeah, brilliant art.
One of my favourite things is when Micro Machines did those little books that you opened up and had the little ships inside.
Yes.
And they did Heir to the Empire, didn't they? And I think they did Dark Force Rising, but they didn't do the other one.
Yeah, they definitely did Air and Dark Force and that. I know I've got True Supercura, and I think they did one of the Jedi Academy ones. I think I've got 3 or 4 of them.
Yeah.
They didn't do as many as they should have done.
No, but they were lovely.
Yeah,
Little kind of fake books made out of cardboard, and you opened them up, and they're like almost like they'd burnt through, and you could see the ships inside. They were cool.
It was a cool era. I mean, I know it's not the topic we're talking about, but it was a really cool era for collectibles. You know, because they were spinning off from stuff like this, and those Micro Machines, that sort of glue sort of era, was so much fun because, as you say, you could get little mini versions of, you know, these vehicles and stuff that you wouldn't get anywhere else. You just wouldn't find them anywhere else. There's no other versions of some of these ships. You can only get them as these little dinky, you know, book. They've got to be small to fit inside a book. You know, really cool little era. And like I say, using the same artwork and sort of adapting it, it was ace. I might go upstairs and have a look at them in a bit. I haven't looked at them forever.
Yeah, they were fab.
Yeah, I love the fact that you just said this era of collectibles was the best, because Micro Machines and Bendhams, what else were we talking about, Mark?
Blimey. You got
well, you're talking about, the Powerful Force 2 range.
Yeah.
Which gave us a Mara and gave us a Thrawn.
Yeah, it gave us expanded.
Yeah. See, I would have put that a bit later in these books, but I'll let you off if we're mixing in the 90s. I mean, you're right. I love Power the Force too. So yeah. Especially
Monkey Face Leia.
The 90s is an underappreciated era for Star Wars. Certainly, Dave Tree will tell you this. In terms of collectibles, it's like the lost decade. It's crazy until you get to the sequel, to the prequel trilogy. But you know, there's a lot of stuff, especially sort of post Last Command, up until, you know, sort of 93, 94, 95, when, you know, the Galaxy Mag was sort of around and all that sort of era. There was more stuff coming out than people remember. It's worth looking back and seeing what sort of things were there, because I think Hamilton were doing the plates, I think, and like I say, doing stuff, and Screaming were doing the kits, and, you know, Ertl were doing things. There's licensees that have long gone from the franchise now, but, you know, there's all sorts of stuff. I think people would be quite surprised to realise how much there was.
You're making everyone fall in love with those unloved lines, Mark. I mean, some of those I've just forgotten all about, yeah.
I get a percentage, that's why.
Before we close out then, gents, anything you'd just like to say about these books? Maybe just, where do they sit with regards to your favourite literature from Star Wars?
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, do you know what? Especially reading the more recent Thrawn stuff, and I haven't finished reading Chaos Rising, so I can't include that. But sometimes I do think at the moment people have put Timothy Zahn on that pedestal, and therefore everything that he's going to write is going to be gold. But I don't think that's the case. But I think partly because of obviously the nostalgia factor for me anyway, this trilogy is definitely up there. I mean, and like Mark said earlier, there's no, if it's a tank, there's no way. I mean, there's probably no way that we would be talking about this on a podcast today, and there probably definitely wouldn't be kind of any other books afterwards, and probably no special edition, no prequels, yada yada yada. So I think it's historically important, and also it's fun to kind of look back and kind of see where the timelines, do kind of veer off differently between what was written in the Heir to the Empire and all that, and actually what happens in the prequels and all that kind of stuff, which is that whole issue with like, Schrodinger's kind of canon, where it's canon until it's basically overwritten by the guy whose, idea came up with in the first place, that kind of thing. So yeah, for me it's up there, but there's so many Star Wars books, and nowadays there's so many Star Wars books in different styles that it's really difficult to kind of compare eras and compare, by far this is probably one of the strongest like Legends books and trilogies, but it's harder to then kind of like compare it to what we've got in the prequel era and what we've got in some of the sequel era. I mean, I don't know, what do you reckon, Newbold?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I'm very fond of them because of the era. Because like you say, when it came back, it was such a big hit. We'd had nothing for so long. They kind of turned up on the shelves almost unannounced. I remember walking into Waterstones and just there they were. So what the hell are they? And grabbed it and read it and chomped through it and couldn't believe it, because at the time I was, and obviously still am, into Star Trek, but then I was reading a lot of Trek novels. And then all of a sudden the Star Wars novel turns up and wow, But yeah, I mean, it's a good point about Zahn I nearly said Thrawn. It's a good point about Zahn in the terms of for the book companies that he writes for Lucasfilm, getting him onto these projects, they must, and they do, see a spike in sales when it's one of his books that comes along. And 30 years in now, if you know that as a book publisher you've got a Thrawn trilogy or a Zahn book coming every sort of 5, 6, 7 years, to keep feeding the beast sort of thing. It's a good little thing to have in the back pocket. And like you say, he's been allowed to go off and expand on the Thrawn, and especially now with this new trilogy that, like I say, we're both working our way through the current book, and reviews coming soon to Fantatrax. But he's now filling out a bit more of the history of the Chiss Ascendancy and the home world and the background to his own personal history, which is great. That an author can have that latitude. You look through Star Wars literature. Okay, Alan Dean Foster wrote the original Star Wars novel. Then he comes back and he writes, Approaching Storm, and then he comes back and writes Force Awakens and Splinter and the Mind's Eye back in the day. He had a good little run at it. The only other guy I would say that's had a real sort of almost a free reign approaching the level of Zahn is Kevin J. Anderson, who was like the guy for most of the 90s. He was so involved in doing so much stuff. Now he writes all the Dune stuff with Frank Herbert's son, but he stepped right away from it. But Zahn had a lot of latitude, and most of the stuff he's done, and I've not read all of it, can't pretend I have, but all the stuff I've read, I've enjoyed. But his stuff feels like it's filling out a lot of history, and there's a lot of meaty stuff in there. Sometimes I wonder, some of the books, I think there's barely enough plot to fill a comic, let alone a book. And they're a bit unsubstantial. Maybe that's just the way of the world. It's almost like they're scared at the moment to take any big leaps. And Heir to the Empire was one of those books, and he had a whole era of books where what super weapon's going to be in this book? Mm-hmm. They did become super weapon of the week. It became a bit of a trope, and it's almost unavoidable in the Star Wars galaxy, because that's kind of part of the. You've had 3 films and 2 of them had Death Stars in them. It's hard to get away from the fact that these big weapons are a big part of Star Wars. But nevertheless, at least they were trying to do something bold. New Jedi Order was really doing something very bold and big, and the galaxy's being invaded, Coruscant's being taken, billions are dying. It's big stuff. And you even look to the sequel trilogy as a trilogy of films, and it's like, what new stuff did we really get in the sequel trilogy? I can't really think of much of anything apart from Skype calling yourself from one planet to another. There's not an awful lot that felt fresh and new, as enjoyable as it was, and I did enjoy them. Whereas these books were the start of an era of Star Wars that was really going out there trying to do something different and new, and it's still got a massive fandom. So I'd probably say that's the best legacy of this book, tumbling into all the other books that followed, Was it really got people into this era and these books and Star Wars as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a really nice opportunity for me to revisit these, and as my summary of The Last Command testifies, I haven't quite got through my recap of the full trilogy, but I've read so much of these novels I've read them all. Over time, it mushes into one. Sometimes you forget which book that plot point was in, and so to go back to this and sort of look at it with fresh eyes just to discuss it tonight has been really quite wonderful. You kind of realise just how good it was and how nuanced the bad guy was, and that's slightly ahead of its time. Star Wars villains were a bit cape swishy and mustache twirling. Vader himself was from that classic tradition, whereas Thrawn was, you could relate to him, you understood him, and sort of just to go back and reread these things or just refresh myself to the stories and the characters has been really good. And as both Marks have said, the fact that we're still talking about this and these characters are still being celebrated and published is a real testament to this piece of work.
Wonderful.
I like what you say there, Craig. That's a good point about Vader being the classic sort of cape swishy villain. He's more like Ming the Merciless in that respect. In that you look at Thrawn and it's like, you imagine if Wile E. Coyote actually made it work and got the Roadrunner. Thrawn is more like Wile E. Coyote when he's on a good day, when he wins. So.
I mean, those modern novels, he's more and more like a modern reading of Sherlock Holmes. It's just
you're right. Yeah,
following it along, and you kind of go, well, he knows what's going on, and I don't, and Vanto doesn't know what's going on, but it's going to play out, and it's got that real kind of self-referential type to it sometimes.
Yeah, I suppose that in itself is sometimes fun because it's kind of like you just go, okay, well let's just see let's see how he's going to figure this one out.
Not if he's going to figure it out, but how. Yeah.
How exactly? Yeah, it's like Sherlock Holmes in that respects, or it's something very similar. Can I just say, public apology, I think needs to be had right now to the Yateley library, because I still have your copy of Dark Force Rising. That I may or may not have intentionally have kept. Was that October 93? I think it was. So yeah, sorry about that. I probably got a few late fees on that one.
Yeah, that's going to cost you.
And they are listening.
Yeah, of course they are. Yeah.
Well, gents, thank you so much for joining us. It was great. You were clear options to go to because you know your stuff when it comes to this. So it's been fun just to listen to you boys relive the books. They were great. Yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting
us on. Great fun.
Yeah, it's been fun. We should do this again.
Definitely. And go and check out Cannon Fodder. There must be is there a new one out, newish?
I think we're recording it on Sunday, I think.
Oh well, so it's imminent. So how long do you what's your turnaround like after recording?
Oh blimey, 3 days.
Nice. So by Wednesday next week, check out fanfortracks.com. Be on there, and if you want to go and check it out, Mark does 8 articles a day.
At the least, I think.
It is the place to keep up to date for everything, which as a fan we do thank you. Gents, thank you so much, really do appreciate it.
You're welcome. Take care.
Cheers.
Wonderful. Don't forget to check out all our other shows this month. We've got books galore this month, 8 shows in total, so another 6 following this to come, plus our usual vintage and modern roundtables. Don't forget you can check us out on social media. Just look for Facebook, Instagram and Twitter and just search for Generation Skywalker. Go to www.generationskywalker.com where you can find links to all our shows, all our blogs and all our enhanced versions of the shows. And there's also links to the social media over there as well. So check it all out. But it is for this show. Goodbye. And we are Generation Skywalker.